On June 1945, heat pressed against Camp Perry, Ohio, where 17 German boys stood behind wire fencing. Recently arrived prisoners whose war had ended before their childhoods ever truly began. Faces hollow, eyes wary, uniforms oversized, silence heavy as the lake air surrounding the former training ground. The war in Europe had ended weeks earlier, yet its residue lingered here, carried across the Atlantic in thin bodies and haunted stares, as these boys waited uncertainly for instructions, food, and a future no longer defined by commands barked in collapsing cities. They ranged from 14 to 17 years old, captured amid rubble and cellars, labeled Volkssturm by paperwork that could not capture fear, indoctrination, or desperation. Boys who had held rifles heavier than their arms, now clutching uncertainty instead, quietly together now. Camp Perry itself appeared orderly and intact. Barracks clean, paths swept, Lake Erie glinting beyond fences. A landscape contradicting everything propaganda had promised, leaving the boys disoriented by normalcy, suspicious of kindness, and unsure where danger truly lived within this place. Processing lines moved them through examinations and records. American efficiency replacing chaos, while guards watched carefully, balancing security with restraint, recognizing children beneath uniforms, and following orders that emphasize separation, supervision, and the possibility of rehabilitation rather than punishment after surrender. Meals arrived regularly, astonishing portions compared to siege rations. Bread with butter, meat, milk, and vegetables. Nourishment that softened sharp faces and confused minds. As bodies began trusting abundance again, even while memories of hunger refused to release their grip. Silence dominated their early days, broken only by instructions and distant gulls, because language failed boys who had learned obedience over expression, trauma over trust, leaving emotions sealed behind disciplined stillness, a survival habit forged under bombardment and relentless authority. American guards varied in age and experience, some veterans of Europe, others stateside soldiers, all adjusting perceptions while observing adolescents who mirrored younger brothers, creating tension between memory of battle and instinct to protect, an emotional contradiction felt on every shift. Education programs were announced early. English lessons and mathematics offered alongside routine work, signaling intentions beyond attention as officers believed these boys would return home someday, carrying impressions of America that might influence shattered societies rebuilding from ruins after war. Rumors circulated quietly among the boys, shaped by years of fear, wondering whether Americans were cruel or fair, whether captivity meant harm or chance, uncertainty thickening each night as Lake Erie winds rattled barracks and sleep arrived fitfully without answers. Among them stood Klaus, the youngest, small even among peers, and Hans, the oldest, carrying defiance like armor, embodying different responses to collapse. Innocence numbed by shock versus belief hardened by propaganda, both equally unprepared for peace and uncertainty ahead. As evening settled over Camp Perry, 17 boys lay on cots staring upward, measuring safety by routine sounds, sensing lives paused between past devastation and unknown futures, unaware that a simple American gesture would soon crack defenses and awaken childhood. The People's Storm emerged during Germany's final collapse, when leadership abandoned restraint and gathered children into uniformed desperation, calling it duty, honor, survival, anything that disguised panic, transforming schools and playgrounds into recruitment pools for a Reich already bleeding out. By late 1944, the Volkssturm became policy, a last mobilization sweeping old men and boys into service, erasing age limits as cities burned, because ideology demanded sacrifice even when victory was impossible, turning youth into expendable symbols of loyalty rather than soldiers. Classrooms emptied as teachers handed students marching orders, replacing textbooks with rifles, drilling slogans instead of tactics, convincing children that standing against tanks was noble, because retreat meant betrayal, and surrender was portrayed as annihilation worse than death itself. Many boys joined without choice, conscription notices delivered to shattered homes, parents powerless or absent, authority absolute, while others volunteered, fueled by propaganda promising heroism, belonging, and meaning in chaos, unaware they were being consumed by a collapsing state. Uniforms rarely fit, boots slipped from thin feet. Weapons outweighed their carriers, ammunition scarce, training rushed, because preparation no longer mattered, only numbers and appearances, a desperate attempt to slow inevitability with bodies too young to understand mortality. Orders were simple and brutal, hold intersections, defend bridges, delay advances regardless of survival, while officers vanished or died, leaving children clustered in ruins, improvising defenses from rubble, fear masked by shouted slogans learned before comprehension ever developed. Food shortages hollowed them further, rations scarce, hunger constant, weakening bodies already strained by stress, while bombardment erased familiar streets, forcing boys to fight among neighbors' homes, watching childhood landmarks disappear beneath artillery and advancing armor. Ideology filled gaps where guidance failed, repeated promises that sacrifice would redeem Germany, that enemies were monsters, that death was meaningful, narratives sustaining obedience even as evidence contradicted every claim, binding children emotionally to a cause already extinguished. Some boys believed fervently, clinging to certainty because doubt was unbearable amid destruction, while others complied silently, understanding resistance meant punishment, imprisonment, or execution, leaving no space for conscience, only survival within a narrowing corridor of choices. The Volkssturm blurred lines between civilian and soldier completely, making childhood itself a casualty, because once armed, boys became targets, stripped of protections, absorbed into a war machine devouring whatever remained in its reach during final convulsions. When Allied forces closed in, many units dissolved instantly, children fleeing or surrendering, some fighting briefly then collapsing, because endurance demanded by ideology exceeded human limits, especially for bodies still growing, minds still forming, spirits already fractured. Those who survived carried invisible wounds deeper than scars, shaped by betrayal from authorities meant to protect them, learning too early that nations can sacrifice youth without hesitation, a lesson that followed them into captivity, silence, and uncertain peace. Berlin's final days unfolded amid smoke and shattered stone, where boys crouched in cellars clutching rifles, listening to artillery pound streets above, learning to distinguish shell calibers by sound, because survival depended on instincts formed faster than childhood should ever allow. Cellars became classrooms of terror, damp basements filled with frightened civilians and armed teenagers, sharing stale air and rumors, while ceilings trembled constantly, dust falling like snow, reminding everyone that the city's skeleton was collapsing around them relentlessly. In the rubble above, boys moved through familiar neighborhoods rendered unrecognizable, landmarks erased, streets blocked by debris, fighting among tramcars and broken storefronts, because retreat was forbidden and every corner was declared a final stand. Weapons were mismatched and unreliable, Panzerfausts scavenged from ruins, rifles missing parts, ammunition counted obsessively, because resupply no longer existed, forcing children to make decisions about when firing was worth the cost of revealing positions. Fear manifested differently among them, some shaking uncontrollably, others strangely calm, dissociating amid chaos, because the mind adapts when overwhelmed, numbing emotions to function, even as bodies trembled from exhaustion and hunger. Soviet armor loomed like unstoppable machines, grinding forward regardless of resistance, while boys fired from windows and collapsed stairwells, knowing hits were unlikely, yet believing orders promised meaning, even as tanks rolled past fallen friends without pause. Cellars filled with wounded makeshift bandages fashioned from curtains, whispers replacing screams to avoid detection, because noise invited death, teaching boys to suppress pain, compassion, and panic simultaneously, lessons learned too quickly under impossible conditions. Night offered little relief, flares turning darkness into ghostly daylight, shadows dancing on shattered walls, sleep impossible, because bombardment continued without rhythm, erasing any sense of time, leaving only moments measured between explosions. Some boys questioned everything in those hours, wondering why adults vanished, why promised reinforcements never arrived, why survival felt like disobedience, doubts forming quietly, dangerous thoughts suppressed because they threatened fragile cohesion holding them together. Others clung tighter to belief, shouting slogans louder as shells fell closer, because conviction provided structure amid collapse, allowing them to feel purposeful rather than abandoned, even as evidence mounted that sacrifice served no achievable objective. When lines finally broke, chaos replaced commands. Boys fleeing through sewers and alleys, discarding weapons, hands raised instinctively, because survival overcame indoctrination, revealing how thin ideology becomes when confronted by immediate mortality. Those who emerged from Berlin's ruins carried memories etched deeper than scars, images of cellars, rubble, and fear recurring endlessly, because childhood had ended there, buried beneath a city destroyed by adults who demanded loyalty beyond reason. Capture came suddenly, hands raised amid smoke and exhaustion. As American soldiers moved carefully through ruins, surprised to find boys instead of hardened veterans, their rifles dropped without protest. Relief and shame mixing as the fighting finally stopped around them quietly together everywhere nearby silently. Processing followed quickly, searches and identification conducted with efficiency. Numbers replacing names as paperwork advanced, because order mattered even after chaos, teaching boys that surrender meant structure, routine, and survival within rules enforced by unfamiliar uniforms and accents from distant lands overseas, unknown future looming. They were gathered, fed sparingly at first to avoid illness, then transported westward, trucks rumbling past civilians staring curiously, because the war ended abruptly here, creating surreal contrasts between destruction remembered and landscapes untouched by bombs or hunger, fields, farms, highways, towns peaceful distant ahead. Railway cars carried them through Germany's interior, windows revealing fields and villages spared devastation, intensifying disbelief, because memory insisted everything should be broken, while reality outside suggested continuity. Life proceeding despite collapse witnessed days earlier by frightened children, soldiers, guards, alike quietly watching passing slowly. At ports they boarded ships, enormous and humming with machinery, guarded yet oddly safe, because danger now felt distant, replaced by seasickness and uncertainty. As waves erased familiar shores and carried boys toward continents they barely imagined beyond war stories. Maps, rumors, fears, childhood dreams. Life aboard followed strict routines, meals timed and monitored, sleeping crowded yet orderly, because control reassured captors and captives alike, giving days shape, allowing boys to regain weight slowly while minds drifted between fear and numb reflection, during endless crossings across gray oceans toward uncertainty. Guards watched closely, some stern, others quietly compassionate, sharing cigarettes or smiles, because proximity softened hostility, revealing similarities beneath uniforms, as boys realized enemies spoke kindly, worried about families, and missed home just as deeply during long nights aboard ships crossing oceans together uneasily, silently. Illness struck some during transit, weakened bodies reacting to regular food, prompting medical checks, because years of deprivation left systems fragile, reminding everyone that survival extended beyond combat, requiring patience, care, and restraint unfamiliar to desperate youths facing recovery, slowly, painfully, uncertainly together, afloat still. As days blurred, conversations shifted, anger softening into questions, because distance allowed reflection, boys comparing memories, doubting slogans, wondering about families left behind, realizing the world was larger and more complex than wartime lessons permitted during long crossings under foreign skies with unknown futures awaiting. Arrival in America shocked senses, ports bustling, buildings intact, people well fed, because war had not scarred this land similarly, confronting boys with stark contrasts that challenged narratives of universal suffering preached relentlessly throughout their upbringing by distant leaders. Radios, classrooms, posters years before capture. Transportation continued inland, trains rolling through green countryside, towns untouched by ruins because geography preserved innocence here, forcing boys to confront loss differently, measuring what was destroyed at home against what remained possible elsewhere in peaceful America beyond oceans, wars, borders, time, memory, guilt, sorrow. By the time camps appeared, fenced yet orderly, fear had changed shape, because captivity now promised food and safety, introducing a strange limbo between punishment and care, where former child soldiers waited to rediscover identities stripped away by war propaganda, violence, hunger, loss, silence, memory. Life at Camp Perry settled into predictable rhythms, mornings announced by whistles and orderly movement, because routine replaced chaos, offering structure to boys whose days had been ruled by fear, allowing bodies to rest and minds to slowly disengage from constant vigilance learned in ruins. Meals became anchors of time, breakfast, lunch, and dinner served regularly, portions generous compared to memories of scarcity, because nourishment signaled safety, teaching boys that hunger no longer dictated decisions, even as they ate cautiously, mistrusting abundance after years of deprivation. Silence marked early days, conversations brief and guarded, because speaking risked vulnerability and words still felt dangerous, carrying echoes of slogans and commands, making boys hesitant to articulate thoughts not shaped by obedience or survival instincts forged during collapse. Guards enforced rules calmly, without shouting or cruelty, surprising captives conditioned to brutality. Because authority here functioned differently, encouraging compliance through consistency rather than terror, subtly challenging assumptions taught relentlessly about enemies and power during formative years. Work assignments were light, gardening, cleaning, simple maintenance, because labor aimed to occupy rather than exhaust, giving hands purpose while minds wandered, processing memories without constant threat, allowing exhaustion to transform from fear-driven to restorative fatigue at day's end. Education followed afternoons, English lessons, and arithmetic taught patiently, because learning reframed identity, replacing soldier roles with student ones, encouraging curiosity rather than aggression, slowly reintroducing concepts of growth and possibility beyond battlefield expectations internalized too young. Food continued reshaping bodies, cheeks filling, strength returning incrementally, because recovery required time, reminding boys that healing lagged behind safety as digestive systems adjusted cautiously, supervised by medics aware that sudden abundance could harm weakened frames. Silence softened gradually, shared experiences prompting quiet exchanges. Stories whispered at night about families, homes, doubts, because distance from propaganda allowed honesty, revealing diversity of belief and regret beneath uniform narratives once enforced without question or alternative. Some resisted change, clinging to ideology as identity, because surrendering belief felt like betrayal of fallen friends, creating internal conflict between gratitude for care and loyalty to memories shaped by war's intensity and loss, still unresolved, deeply personal. Others embraced routine eagerly, absorbing lessons, enjoying meals, because normalcy felt revolutionary, offering relief from constant terror, allowing glimpses of adolescence previously denied. Moments of laughter, tentative yet genuine, emerging unexpectedly during mundane tasks, conversations, shared bread time. American landscapes outside fences fascinated them. Lakes, grass, unbroken buildings. Because intact surroundings contradicted internalized expectations of universal devastation, forcing boys to reconsider narratives of inevitable ruin in question who had benefited from such beliefs imposed relentlessly. Unlearning the war proved uneven and painful. Because indoctrination dissolved slowly, but Camp Perry's routine quietly worked, replacing fear with predictability, slogans with questions, and obedience with reflection, preparing boys for futures uncertain yet no longer defined solely by violence. The guards at Camp Perry carried their own invisible burdens, veterans returning from Europe with memories that refused silence. Because war followed them home, shaping how they looked at the boys behind the fence, recognizing fear, exhaustion, and loss mirrored across uniforms. Some guards approached cautiously, maintaining distance, because resentment lingered from fallen comrades, making it difficult to separate children from the regime they served, even unwillingly, requiring emotional discipline to perform duties without cruelty or misplaced vengeance. Others felt immediate empathy, seeing younger brothers or sons in the prisoners' faces, because age collapsed enemy lines, reminding them that these boys were drafted before fully understanding consequence, victims of decisions made far beyond their control. Interactions were regulated yet human, orders delivered firmly but without malice, because professionalism demanded restraint, creating space where trust could grow slowly, through consistent behavior rather than gestures grand enough to raise suspicion or reopen wounds. Shared routines fostered familiarity, guards observing boys learning, eating, sleeping peacefully, because ordinariness challenged battlefield images, replacing caricatures with individuals, each carrying distinct histories, personalities, and coping mechanisms shaped by trauma rather than ideology alone. Conversations emerged cautiously, broken English and German bridging gaps. Because curiosity overcame fear, guards asking ages, hometowns, families, discovering parallels in rural lives, school experiences, dreams interrupted by war on opposite sides of the ocean. Trauma surfaced unexpectedly, nightmares causing boys to wake screaming, guards responding not with punishment but reassurance, because they recognized symptoms from comrades, understanding that sleep often reopened memories daytime discipline kept suppressed beneath stoic exteriors. Guards struggled privately, balancing compassion with authority, because emotional involvement risked blurring boundaries, yet detachment felt cruel, forcing constant negotiation between military roles and human instincts shaped by shared suffering. Some boys tested limits, expressions of defiance masking confusion, guards responding patiently, because punishment reinforced fears, while calm correction modeled alternative power structures, subtly teaching accountability without humiliation or violence. Moments of kindness accumulated quietly, extra explanations, slower commands, shared jokes, because empathy required no announcements, gradually dismantling assumptions that enemies were incapable of decency or moral complexity. For guards, watching boys heal reopened wounds, because it highlighted what could not be undone, comrades lost, innocence destroyed elsewhere, creating bittersweet pride mixed with grief, emotions rarely acknowledged within military culture. Across the fence, trauma intertwined, former enemies bound by shared exposure to violence, discovering that survival left marks regardless of uniform, teaching both sides that healing demanded patience, humility, and recognition of humanity beyond orders, borders, or past allegiances. The idea emerged quietly during a routine meeting, when a guard mentioned surplus ice cream from the mess, wondering aloud whether a simple treat could soften hardened nerves, because deprivation had defined these boys' lives, and abundance itself might communicate safety better than lectures. Skepticism followed immediately, because generosity toward prisoners challenged ingrained discipline, raising fears of disorder or manipulation. Yet psychology suggested trust often began with unexpected kindness, especially for adolescents conditioned to expect punishment instead of care after years of indoctrination and violence. Planners debated logistics carefully, portion sizes, timing, supervision, because symbolism mattered more than calories. The act needed to feel normal, not coerced. A fleeting moment resembling peacetime childhood rather than transactional reward for obedience within a controlled military environment setting. When the decision was approved experimentally, tension rippled through the camp. Because expectations cut both ways, guards feared chaos, boys anticipated tricks. Everyone braced for disappointment shaped by years where gifts concealed consequences rather than goodwill or compassion freely given. On the chosen afternoon, freezers were rolled out ceremoniously, metal lids lifting to reveal color and sweetness, because visual abundance itself disrupted scarcity thinking, challenging assumptions that kindness always demanded payment or submission from frightened recipients of authority figures nearby. The boys approached hesitantly, scanning faces for signals, because survival had taught caution, yet when spoons touched ice cream, expressions shifted, surprise dissolving suspicion, revealing joy unfiltered, fragile, almost forgotten within minutes across the group simultaneously. Laughter followed softly, then spread. Guards watched closely, hands near belts, because policy required readiness. But posture relaxed gradually, as no one hoarded, fought, or fled, instead sharing flavors, negotiating turns, learning that pleasure could exist without threat inside confinement, under watchful eyes briefly together. Psychologically, the gamble targeted control narratives. Because allowing choice disrupted conditioning, boys selected flavors independently, asserting preference, a small autonomy rehearsal, reinforcing identity beyond uniform numbers, and imposed collective guilt from propaganda and wartime, disciplined structures they endured for years. Some boys cried quietly afterward, overwhelmed by normalcy, because sweetness reopened memories of kitchens and summers, reminding them what was lost, yet also what might return. Planting cautious hope amid barbed wire and guard towers nearby, silence followed briefly together. Not every response was simple joy, because a few rejected portions, distrust too ingrained, guards respected refusals, understanding consent mattered. The offer alone signaled change, even when acceptance required more time and repeated exposure to kindness. Patience remained essential daily. Administratively, the experiment was logged neutrally. Because success required discretion, reports mentioned morale stabilization, reduced tension, improved compliance, translating compassion into language bureaucracy tolerated, protecting the fragile program from premature cancellation by skeptical superiors overseeing operations. Quietly it continued weekly. In retrospect, ice cream altered nothing strategic, yet it shifted inner landscapes. Because trust grew incrementally, teaching boys and guards alike that humanity survived war. Sometimes revealed through something cold, sweet, and unexpectedly generous within harsh confinement environments. Memory preserved it. Vanilla was chosen deliberately because it was familiar, unthreatening, and plain. A flavor without history or symbolism. Yet when spoons dipped and tongues tasted, memories surged, kitchens reappeared, and guarded faces softened into something younger, trembling between relief and disbelief. The first boy smiled before he realized it, lips whitening with cold, eyes watering, because restraint collapsed suddenly, and the others noticed instantly, laughter rippling like a forgotten language returning, fragile yet contagious, filling the yard with sounds unheard since sirens ruled days. Vanilla melted quickly under summer sun, streaking fingers and uniforms. Because nobody remembered etiquette anymore, they licked hands shamelessly, laughing, embarrassed, alive, rediscovering bodies not solely instruments of survival, but vessels capable of pleasure without punishment or suspicion afterward lingering. Guards watched tears mix with vanilla drips, because emotion surprised them too. Training had promised hatred, yet children cried softly, shoulders shaking, and something heavy loosened inside uniforms, a realization that enemies could look like sons or brothers at home. One boy whispered Denka without thinking because gratitude resurfaced instinctively, then froze, fearing reprimand. But none came, only nods, quiet acceptance. An unspoken agreement that kindness crossed languages, uniforms, and barbed wire boundaries today within the temporary camp afternoon calm. Vanilla became a teacher that afternoon because it required nothing but presence, showing how safety feels ordinary, not triumphant, and how childhood returns not through speeches, but through simple rituals repeated without threat or surveillance by patient adults nearby together. For minutes, time loosened its grip because war receded. Replaced by sticky fingers and laughter, the boys forgot numbers, ranks, graves, remembering only flavors and friends, improvising childhood inside fences never designed for joy or mercy, warmth, trust, hope, briefly. Several guards later admitted their throats tightened. Because authority felt unnecessary, they saw healing happen without commands, realizing discipline alone could not mend shattered adolescence, while gentleness achieved compliance naturally, effortlessly, almost invisibly during that single shared afternoon moment together. Vanilla ended, but its echo lingered, because memory imprints stronger than fear. That night boys slept deeper, dreams sweeter, bodies relaxed, and the camp felt quieter, as if conflict itself paused respectfully outside the wire fences, towers, shadows, listening silently. Not every wound healed instantly, because trauma resists miracles, yet a door opened inward, allowing trust to enter cautiously, teaching both sides that recovery begins with moments that feel small, shared, and undeniably human within constrained spaces, guarded yet hopeful. Vanilla stained records nowhere because paperwork ignored tenderness, but those present carried it forward, a reference point when anger returned, reminding them of boys crying over ice cream, proof that innocence persisted beyond barbed wire, memories, uniforms, rules, nights, long. In that fleeting sweetness, childhood returned briefly, because permission mattered, allowing vulnerability without cost. And though the war's shadow remained, Vanilla marked a beginning, teaching 17 boys they could feel safe again for a moment, together, under watchful skies, quietly. When the cups emptied, silence fell, because the rawness of tears left a residue heavier than words, and the boys sat still, breathing unevenly, processing sensations unfamiliar and complex, a mixture of relief, shame, and confusion that tugged at their bodies, hearts, and fledgling thoughts simultaneously. Hans stared at the ground, because pride battled the vulnerability he had displayed, and defiance struggled with recognition, realizing that trust and kindness could exist outside propaganda, and that American soldiers were capable of empathy, an idea that challenged every lesson drilled into him during Berlin's final desperate weeks. Klaus picked at crumbs because his mind replayed the flavor, the cold, and the fleeting joy, while simultaneously questioning years of indoctrination, wondering how something as small as vanilla ice cream could shatter fear, suspicion, and anger that had been meticulously cultivated in children trained to kill. Some boys whispered to each other because sharing understanding seemed necessary, words halting and awkward, yet bonding in mutual recognition of what had passed, revealing fragments of humanity they had thought lost, understanding slowly that life could contain moments of pleasure, even amidst the ruins of memories scarred by war. Mitchell observed quietly, because witnessing awakening required patience, noting that children previously rigid with discipline began to relax, that eyes softened, and gestures became less defensive, yet the shadow of guilt lingered. For many felt complicity in a war they had barely comprehended, trapped by loyalty and obedience. Caldwell guided discussions because reflection mattered, asking questions about belief, morality, and obedience, and challenging boys to reconcile propaganda with reality, encouraging them to articulate confusion, fear, and regret, slowly mapping a pathway from indoctrination to awakening, from guilt to understanding, a psychological recalibration essential for their survival. Letters to the Red Cross began because some sought connection to family, attempting to fill voids left by separation, bombing, or death, and in writing, they learned to express vulnerability, hopes, and fear, discovering that communication itself could rebuild identity fractured by coercion and the urgency of survival. Evening brought quiet contemplation because the sun lowered behind Lake Erie, casting shadows across barracks floors, and the boys reflected internally, piecing together a worldview beyond propaganda, re-examining past actions through emerging empathy, confronting personal responsibility, and slowly integrating guilt with recognition that they were victims as much as instruments of war. Hans finally spoke, because after hours of silence, he tested truth in words, admitting confusion and remorse, asking how to forgive himself for believing lies, and Caldwell responded gently, framing understanding not as absolution, but as a foundation for choices moving forward, highlighting responsibility tempered by age and circumstance. Conversations between boys grew longer because curiosity sparked, discussion about America, morality, and human nature emerged, revealing desire for comprehension, not confrontation, as they navigated moral landscapes they had never been permitted to question. Realizing that beliefs instilled in childhood could be dismantled with exposure, experience, and reflection. Sleep arrived slowly because mental activity remained high, processing flavors, gestures, and conversations that symbolized hope, awakening, and the human capacity to heal, imprinting memories that would counteract indoctrination, teaching that trust, kindness, and choice existed even in confinement, allowing dreams not dominated by fear, but possibility. By morning, a subtle transformation occurred because eyes carried awareness, demeanor hinted at softened defenses, and each boy faced the world with a tentative understanding that survival did not require hardness alone, and that acknowledgement of guilt could coexist with curiosity, hope, and the fragile yet undeniable return of childhood. The memory of that day lingered because it marked a subtle yet profound turning point when innocence interrupted trauma, and the frozen sweetness of ice cream became a symbol of mercy, possibility, and humanity restored, creating a mental imprint that would shape each boy's understanding of compassion for decades. For Klaus, it mattered because he learned that childhood could exist after destruction, that joy could survive devastation, and that simple acts of kindness could penetrate defenses built by years of indoctrination, fear, and combat, reminding him that even in the aftermath of war, small gestures carried immense power. Hans reflected quietly because the experience dismantled pride and defiance, forcing acknowledgement of vulnerability and remorse, while also presenting the possibility of transformation, showing him that recognition of mistakes and exposure to genuine kindness were essential to reclaiming not only trust in others, but faith in himself as a human being. The guards remembered too, because witnessing the boys cry unlocked emotions they had buried, exposing grief, empathy, and regret, revealing that war leaves scars on all participants, whether enemy or ally, and that observing recovery and innocence re-emerge could challenge long-held beliefs about strength, resilience, and the boundaries of human compassion. For Major Caldwell, the significance was professional and personal, because the psychological experiment succeeded beyond expectation, demonstrating that exposure to positive stimuli could catalyze emotional and moral recalibration, breaking the rigid mental frameworks imposed by wartime propaganda and offering insight into how children could recover after enduring unimaginable circumstances. The barracks atmosphere shifted because laughter and curiosity gradually replaced tension. Subtle interactions revealed empathy, and small acts of learning and play flourished, showing that memory, even after trauma, could be reshaped by gentle guidance, nourishment, and care, highlighting the delicate interplay between experience, environment, and the restoration of human dignity. Letters sent home mattered because boys began reconnecting with family, tracing pathways to relatives lost in the chaos, and exploring narratives that confirmed survival while healing grief, revealing that mercy extended beyond immediate care, encompassing the restoration of relationships, the bridging of distance, and the reaffirmation of human bonds torn apart by war. The ice cream moment endured because it represented choice, freedom, and agency, a rare opportunity to act as a child, uncoerced, without fear, and the symbolism persisted as a touchstone, reminding the boys that lives could be reclaimed not through force, but through small, intentional acts of kindness that countered indoctrination. Camp Perry's routine became more than survival because the day embedded hope into everyday rituals, encouraging active participation, learning, and engagement with moral reflection, allowing children to integrate memory, compassion, and awareness into their identities, and demonstrating that rehabilitation required both psychological insight and tangible care administered consistently and empathetically. Conversations among the boys deepened because they began discussing morality, personal responsibility, and the choices they had made, exploring the difference between obedience and conscience, realizing that understanding mercy was essential to processing guilt, trauma, and indoctrination, and that reclaiming life demanded both reflection and the courage to confront painful truths. Years later, the memory endured because every act of kindness that followed, every lesson learned, and every moment of shared humanity could trace roots back to that day, proving that recovery from war's horrors relied not only on survival, but also on recognition, mercy, and the reclamation of lives and identity. In the end, what mattered most was that memory carried lessons, mercy offered a path forward, and the boys, once soldiers in a war they could barely understand, became children again, capable of joy, reflection, and growth, illustrating that even in the aftermath of unimaginable suffering, humanity could be reclaimed, preserved, and celebrated.